Okay, guys, welcome back. In this section of this video, we will be dealing with a more complicated scenario in which we have a frequency table with 6 classes, and we are asked to find the mean, variance, and standard deviation. Okay, so let's start. We have 6 different classes, and as you can see, each class has its own frequency. Okay, so remember, the first step, I would say the very first best step for you guys would be to calculate the midpoint. Okay, so the midpoint, uh, it's calculating by adding the lower boundary plus the upper boundary, dividing it by 2. So for this specific class, the midpoint would be 40 plus 45, which is 85, divided by 2, which is 42.5. So this is how you can calculate your class boundaries. I've already calculated the class boundaries, and as you can see here, for each one, I've put it here. Okay, so for this one, the lower boundary is 34, the upper is 39. If you add them together, divide them by 2, it would be 36.5. So some of you might ask why this table is arranged from high to low. That's fine. It's up to you however you want to arrange your table. You can either start from 10, the lowest value, go to the highest, or the opposite. The order doesn't matter, but we prefer to follow some kind of order, whether ascending or descending. But to let you know, even if you don't follow any order, that's still fine. Okay, so let's now calculate the total frequency. How do we calculate the total frequency? 3 plus 1, 4, 4 plus 4, 8, 8 plus 5, 13, 13 plus 2, 15, 15 plus 5, 20. So your total frequency comes up to 20, right? These are the pieces of information that you will need in order to calculate the standard deviation. Just to remind you, these are the formulas that you have to use. Okay, so again, I pulled up your formula book, and these are the formulas you are using to calculate the mean. This is the formula: f multiplied by x divided by the total mean. That's what we will be doing in the next step, because in order to find the standard deviation, the first step is calculating the mean. Then afterward, we will be using this formula to calculate the standard deviation. And here even you can see that it says frequency distribution. So whenever you have a frequency distribution table, you use this formula to calculate the mean, and this formula to use the standard deviation. So once more, these are in your formula book, and you should be able to locate the formula and know how to use them. So as I just mentioned, the next step would be calculating the mean. So I just copied the formula here so you would know which formula to use. So I will add another column, and I will be multiplying the f frequency by, here instead of using the x, we used xm, which is the middle point. Okay, middle point, because here you don't know whether to use the lower boundary or the upper boundary. That's why we use the xm. So maybe in here you better put it as xm. So the next step is adding a column to my table and finding the corresponding f multiplied by x, and then adding all those values together and calculating the total. So here I added another column. I multiplied xm, right, by xm by the frequency, xm by its associated frequency, xm by its frequency. So every row is considered separately. Then after finding all these values, you add all of these values together. Okay, right? So compare this value that you calculated here with your formula. So far you calculated the top part of this formula, and then here you had calculated the total frequency, right, from before. So the next step would be simply substituting these values, which is 508, right, divided by 20, and this will come up, this will show you the mean or the average. And if you put it in your calculator, it will come up to 25.4. Okay, so the mean is calculated, right? But we're not done yet. So the mean, which is 25.4, is calculated. Now the question is asking about the variance and the standard deviation. Now I will let you know what is the relationship between variance and a standard deviation as a side note. So as a side note here, remember here you're dealing with the sample. So S, as I just mentioned before, is your standard deviation, which I usually show it with STD, okay? And STD, or standard deviation to the power 2, is your variance, okay? So variance is basically, right, variance is basically standard deviation to the power 2, okay? So standard deviation to the power 2. So if you want to know how to calculate the variance, it's basically the same steps as a standard deviation. The only difference is that you don't have to do the very last step. What I mean is you don't need to take the square root, right? So we follow the same step to calculate the variance and the standard deviation for the given frequency table. Okay, remember here we had the scores, we had the midpoint, we had frequency, we had the mean, which we calculated in the previous part, and then the next step would be subtracting each data point from the mean. Remember guys, here the data point is actually your xm. So when you want to calculate, this is your midpoint, right? So here when you want to calculate is 42.5, okay, minus 25.4, which comes up to, I guess, 17.1. Okay, so here the next step would be this one minus this one. Now this minus this, right? You do the same for all of these, and then report it in the next column. Okay, that's why I'm always telling you or advising you to use the table, because it's really helpful when you put it in a table. It's you know, it really helps. So let's say, let me delete this part, so because I already calculated and put in a table. So here you would say that this is 17.1, 11.1, but we're not done yet. We calculated the deviation or the difference. Remember guys, the next step, it's raising each of these values to the power 2. Okay, so each of these values should be raised to the power 2. Okay, now this is the next step. I already calculated. Okay, now, so for this specific formula, what I did, I used this formula but because the frequency is not 1, I had to make some adjustment. So I added an F here, which counts for the frequency. So if I want to use this formula, then I have to add the next column and add and multiply each of these deviation by its associated frequency, right? So what I mean is the next column would be this one, right? The next column would be, because this bit is calculated, now I have to multiply each by its frequency. And now if you do the same and calculate all the steps, okay, you will come up and add all of these numbers together. Then you will come up, after adding everything, you will come up with this value. Let me show it to you. So this one I will delete. Instead I will put this one. So these are the values, but remember you have to add all of these at the end, right? And I think I think the total will come up, if you add all of these, it will come up to 2035.8. Okay, so here you calculated the top part, right? Remember guys, your n was how much? Was your total frequency, and your total frequency was 20. So now you n minus 1 would be 19. So if you divide 2035 by 19, then you will find your variance, which is let me write it down here, 2035.8 divided by 19 would be your variance. And if you calculate it, the answer would be let me write it here, 107.15. okay, this will be your variance. And if you take a square root of your variance, right, it will give you your standard deviation. So the square root of your variance again would be your standard deviation. So put it in your calculator and try to find the value. So it would be something around 10.35. And remember guys, a standard deviation is always a positive value. That's very important. And I will again write down this one as a side note for you, the relationship between how actually variance or standard deviation are related to one another. Standard deviation is the square root of the variance. This is how you can calculate it. It's very important. Again, I have to mention, for calculating the standard deviation for this specific example, I use this formula. But if you take a look at your let's say formula book, you will come across this formula, okay, this formula which I mentioned that we use to calculate the standard deviation. These two calculate the same thing, but the point is, if you use this one, the answer would be a little bit different from this, but it doesn't matter because the difference is not that huge. But at the end of the day, it's up to you which one to use. Okay, now I will continue this video with solving more examples from with frequency table. For the next one, again, I'm gonna give you a simpler example. So there are three classes, as you can see here. There are three classes with a small kind of frequency. So you can see this is the lower limit, upper limit. There are three classes. So what you have to do first, I want you, just as a practice, I want you to create a table, extend this table like this, and write down the lower limit, upper limits. It's not a must, but it's just good for an example. Then next point, next level would be adding or actually finding the midpoint, which is 10 plus 13 divided by 2, which is the midpoint. Okay, because remember, at the end of the day we want to find the mean, and from the mean we want to find the standard deviation. Okay, but remember guys, here I have to emphasize again, the x is xm, right? Because here we have midpoints. So for this specific example, I'm going to use this formula. So that's why I calculated the midpoint. And as you can see here, the next step would be midpoint to the power 2. So what I do here, I raise the midpoint to the power 2. Okay, let me put the answer here. So the next step would be this one. Okay, so but then I have to multiply each of these rows by its frequency, right? So 1 multiplied by this, 3 multiplied by this, 4 multiplied by this, and let's see what it comes up to. Okay, so if you do the same thing and actually simplify the result, you will come up with this one. Okay, right, let me bring down this formula because I want you to see how I do each step. Okay, so now f multiplied by x to the power 2, right, it's calculated. Now what we have to do, now we had to add all of these values together. Okay, so all of these values should be added together. Okay, so let me put all of them together and find the value. So if I put it in the calculator, it will come up to, yeah, this is the value. Okay, so this is the value. Compare it to your formula. This is this part. Okay, we're not done yet. Now we have to deal with the rest of the equation, which is f frequency multiplied by x, right? Frequency multiplied by x, which is the midpoint, and then the whole thing is raised to the power 2. So what I'll do here, I will just add a column, right, and multiply f by m. Now I did f by m. Okay, f by m. Remember, m is the same as xm. Okay, so now what I have to do, I have to again add all of these values together. What I mean is 11.5 plus 15.5, 11.5 plus 3 times 15.5 plus 4 times 19.5. And if I add all of these values together, let's see, it will come up to, okay, now it will come up to 136. Okay, 136. So I multiplied each one by its frequency and then added all of it together. So this is the total, right? I can put it here. Then afterward, as you can see from this part of the equation, Now this value should be raised to the power 2. Okay, so I'm gonna put it here. So 136 to the power 2. Okay, this is the second part, but let's see for this one. Now for the first part of the equation, n, which was 8, right? So I'm gonna cross it with and substitute it with 8 multiplied by this value, which is 2374, right, minus, and here I have 8 multiplied by 7. Okay, and this is your variance. Okay, so your variance would be this value, and if you take a square root from both sides, it will give you the standard deviation. Okay, please put in the comments if there are any issues or if you need more clarification. I will give you another 2 examples, practice question, and I want you to do it for the rest of the class and submit it through D12. So this is example 1. There are 5 classes. I already calculated the mid value, and this is the frequency of each class. I also calculated the total frequency. So what I want you to do, first of all, calculate the mean and a standard deviation. So it's up to you which formula you want to use. As long as you do all the steps correctly, I will accept the answer. This is the first question, and the next question will be, this is the second example. Here, instead of giving you the class boundaries, I just put it like this: lower class limit, upper class limit. In other words, your first class is from 1 to 10 and its frequency is 2. Again, I want you to calculate the mean, and then afterwards continue your calculation till you find the standard deviation. Please let me know in the comments if you have any question or more clarification. I'll see you next time.